Hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope you can hear okay in the room. Yeah? I hope everyone can hear okay online as well. Please write on the chat if that's not the case and we'll sort it. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I will pass the floor straight away to our Vice Dean, Margarida Lima Rego. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here. And without further ado.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for organizing such a wonderful and important event. Here at Nova University, as a public higher education institution, we have as our mission to serve society at the local, regional, and global levels through the progress and dissemination of knowledge and understanding between cultures, societies, and people, by way of excellent teaching and research and the provision of services based on a strong sense of community. That is our mission. I was reading it to make sure I said it properly. And of course, given our mission, solidarity and sustainable development are at the core of what we do and how we think about the world. So the health, economic, social, environmental aspects of sustainability are all major concerns. And we, as lawyers, as people, as legal experts, we have a duty, as does everybody else in our world, to work together in order to make this a better world for the people and for the planet. So we see this as part of our mission, and we organize ourselves here at the law school in thematic areas that reflect these concerns. We want to foster innovation and bring to the world legal experts that are agents of change and that can be a driving force for this movement that has to be everyone's concern, public sector, private sector. And this is why these events such as these are so important, because we really need to, as a center of knowledge dissemination, we really need to contribute to making sure that everyone is aware that we need to work together, because there's no planet B, as someone once said. So our strong areas, the way we see us, we do not organize ourselves in traditional areas like obligations, administrative, criminal. We try to organize ourselves in thematic areas, and the three main ones are innovation and digitation. They are, of course, peace, justice, and effective institutions. Being a law school, that is, of course, a major concern of ours. And sustainability, the three pillars: social, environmental, and economic. Having said this, we also we do not just teach about sustainability. We must walk the talk, meaning that we commit also to having sustainable practices in our daily lives as an institution. And we have, as made us explicit in our recent joining of the UN Global Compact in February 2021. This is our mission. And of course, the UN's 17 SDGs are an invitation to the whole of society. All of us must pull our weight. And this is such a relevant and yet such a challenging undertaking in making sure that we do leave the world a livable place for our next generations. So today's conference comes at a very, very timely, is a very timely event. And I should thank our sponsors, because without them, this would not have been possible. I must begin by thanking the Portuguese government that for joining us in this meritorious effort. I must thank the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology. I must thank the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce. And last but not least, I must thank PLMJ, the law firm, for being our partners from the very beginning of this knowledge center, created by, of course, our very own Claire Bright. My final thanks go to her She is a driving force for innovation and for social change within our university. And so without any further words, I give you back the floor, and I thank everyone for being here and for helping us bring this issue a little bit further. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarida. Thank you to all of you. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here today in presence at Nova School of Law in Lisbon, and also online. I know we have quite a lot of participants joining us online as well, for the second annual conference of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment, which, as Margarida mentioned, I created about 2 years ago now. So this year, the topic of the annual conference is on the draft Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CS3Ds, as I'm told the cool kids call it these days. And this may well be one of the most ambitious legislative proposals on mandatory due diligence that the field of business and human rights has ever seen. But we have come a very long way to get to that point where we can actually discuss a legislative proposal at the European level. We are moving away from a world in which companies are encouraged, but not obliged to respect human rights, to a world where doing business responsibly and sustainably, whilst upholding human rights, decent work, and environmental standards in global value chain is actually becoming the only way of doing business. And it is not only so because investors are increasingly asking for it, because consumers are increasingly asking for it, because there is a business case for doing business responsibly, but it's also the case because it is becoming a legal requirement. Since the unanimous endorsement of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights 11 years ago, we saw an increasing number of companies adopting on a voluntary basis human rights due diligence processes in order to identify, prevent, mitigate, and address human rights impacts that they can become involved with. However, we also know that voluntary approaches are limited and that there remains many, many laggards. So against this backdrop, law can be an extremely powerful tool to bring about positive changes in society. And the Draft European Directive is already having implications on business conduct. We can see that here in Portugal, where many companies are just starting on their sustainability journey. We can see it in Europe more generally, but we can also see it beyond Europe. And not so long ago, I was speaking with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce about the Draft Directive because they are getting ready for it. So the implications of the Draft Directive, what is only a draft at this point, are already being felt quite strongly. But ultimately, in order to allow for better outcomes for the people and better outcome for the planet, the law must be well crafted. And this is why we have put together stellar panels of speakers that will be discussing throughout the conference different aspects of the Draft Directive. We will have 50 speakers from 5 different continents to look at the implications of the directive, both for Europe, but also beyond. Now, these legislative developments are really crystallizing several paradigm shifts that we have been witnesses over the past few years and the past few decades. And I will only focus on 2 main ones here. First of all, the ones that concern the purpose of a corporation. Of course, the main purpose of a corporation remains to make profit. That's logical, inevitable. But there is now an increasing acknowledgement of the need to take into account the interests of stakeholders and of the planet whilst doing so. And secondly, the second change of paradigms concerns the fragmentation of the law that has traditionally allowed to shield the parent company or the head company from responsibility. And that fragmentation of the law is now being challenged as it is increasingly being recognized in legislation and in case law, that head companies or parent companies do have certain duties in relation to workers, in relation to communities, in relation to the environment throughout the value chain. We are now moving away from approaches consisting in turning a blind eye to human rights harms within global value chains to an approach where companies must take positive steps to become aware of adverse human rights impacts in their own activities, but also within their global value chains, and address them. And these are just a few examples of these changes of paradigm that have been taking place in the field. And as my colleague Stéphane Brabant would say, the field of business and human rights has actually witnessed and brought about not only an evolution of the law, but a revolution of the law. And as a French person, I do like a good revolution because it is an instrument of change, generally in an attempt to promote equality, justice, and to combat oppression. And perhaps this is exactly what we need. So now, before passing the floor to our stellar panelists, I would like to address a few thanks, and join Margherita in the thanks that she has addressed. First of all, I would like to sincerely thank all of our speakers and all of our chairs who have agreed to take part in this event today and share their extremely valuable insights with us. Some of them have actually traveled a very long way, so I'm particularly thankful and grateful to them for having undertaken that journey. I would also like to thank our sponsors, PLMJ, the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce, FCT for their generous support, and also the Portuguese government and SEDISH for their continuous partnership. I would like to address a personal thank to my colleague and friend, Laura Nigo Alvarez, who has tirelessly worked with me to make this event happen. We have had also some help from our students along the way, and I would like to thank them all, and in particular, Isabel, Carlotto, who has, I think many of you have been in touch with. Last but not least, I would like to thank our audience in presence and online for accompanying us throughout this event, and I very much hope that you will like it. Thank you very much. I will now pass the floor to Bruno Ferreira, who is a managing partner at PLMJ, where he's coordinating partner of the firm's responsible business areas and partner in the banking and finance capital markets.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to be quick as the less eloquent one on the panel, and I don't want to keep you away from the very interesting discussion we'll have later today. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the Knowledge Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment for this excellent event and for having continued to dedicate a lot of attention to this topic. I've dedicated a significant part of my life to translating regulation into practical terms and helping especially businesses dealing with regulation. And for me, it's very interesting to look at this draft directive and see a clarification on a lot of aspects that, of course, we already had some light on, especially since the UNGPs were approved. But now the light, I would say, is a lot more intense and shines all over the world if it becomes mandatory. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the draft directive, and I think we'll have a discussion on this on a panel later today, is the actual enforcement of the final directive. I've as an amateur researcher and a lifelong practical lawyer, I've dedicated some time to try to understand how this enforcement actually happens and what helps drive this enforcement and the final application. And it's very interesting because in Portuguese, it's actually, we don't have a specific word to translate enforcement in the sense of the application of the regulation and trying to make sure that the regulation is applied. Well, we have similar concepts, but not a direct translation. So we have to elaborate on that. which also is like very illustrative of the way we tend to handle regulation in Portugal. I think I'd be very interested to see how this then plays out in practice. And I think, of course, we'll have probably additional and very powerful mechanisms of enforcement, because we'll have situations where, for example, in jurisdictions where we have a lot of additional enforcement of regulation, we'll have that trickle down through supply chains into the Portuguese jurisdiction. So I'm sure that companies buying produce, for example, from Portuguese companies or other products, they will certainly be dedicated to enforcing the rules, because they do have very strict enforcement in their home jurisdictions. And also some direct remedies, which, for example, from a practical perspective in our law firm, are currently very effective on the competition sector, on breaches of competition rules. We're getting a lot of activity on that front. So it's basically making the enforcement a lot more evident. But I would say that overall, nothing would beat a social conviction of the fact that this is these rules and regulations and this policy is the correct policy. So I think we can try to enforce as much as possible and have a lot of mechanisms, but we need to make sure that people are aware that in addition to the business case that Claire mentioned before, that these rules are important as a social mechanism, and that they should be followed and obeyed, because without that conviction, I think it's going to be more difficult to have a practical impact on the day-to-day of the businesses. But I think this is a really positive outcome overall for the sector. We're really engaged on this also in our firm, and thank you very much for letting us be a part of this. Congratulations, and I hope you have a great session. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. And I will pass the floor to Robert Mark Crocodile, who is a member, very recently appointed member of the UN Working Group on Business Human Rights, and is also Emeritus Professor at the University of Nottingham and a barrister in London, as well as a stellar scholar in business human rights. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you, Claire. I want to just begin by thanking Claire, but also to put in context the amazing thing that she has created by a Centre for Business Human Rights and Environment. She's managed to create it with the wonderful support of Margarita, but also managed to get funding for it, managed to make a presence, managed to get a whole great team behind her. I have experience of this, and it is so hard, I can't tell you. It is grindingly hard, and yet she's still a stellar scholar, and I think she deserves a round of applause. As Claire says, this is strange for me. In fact, it's my first in-person conference as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And I still find it rather weird that I am. And also to think sometimes I'm speaking as part of a working group, not in my usual sort of strange approach to life. So that's a factor I take into account. And those of you who don't know, of course, the role of the working group is to work with states, with businesses, with civil society, based on the promotion of the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights. And there's been a working group in place since 2011. Now, as you might have read, last year there was the working group produced something called a roadmap. And if you haven't, I'd really urge you to read it. I confess I hadn't read it till I was in this role, and now I've read it. But I would urge you to read it because it's really, really helpful in looking through what has been achieved, what are the concerns, etc. And part of it, which is relevant for this, was that the working group acknowledges that regulation in business and human rights is an important way forward. of course, when UN Guiding Principles began, there was a lot of kind of, well, this is separate. We don't want necessary legislation. We don't want a treaty. And over time, things have moved on that. So it's now seen as a necessary part of the smart mix of business and human rights initiatives. And so that's relevant because the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Draft has 11 years behind it of the UNGPs, 11 years of context of the important body of work, not only the authoritative text of the UN Guiding Principles, but also the work of the OECD, the work of the Office of High Commission for Human Rights. Okay, what I'm talking about is the need for regulatory coherence within the context of 11 years of the UN Guiding Principles and many more years of all your skills and knowledge to it. And I also want to add that in that regulatory coherence, there also has to be consistency and, to use a EU word, harmonization of these forms of regulation. And also, I know from my own empirical work, about which a lot of my work has been, that this is what business wants. They want coherence, they want consistency, and they want a degree of harmonization. Indeed, I was part of the amazing study led by Claire and Lisa Smith, which provided a deep dive study on supply chain due diligence for the European Commission. And in that, and let me quote, we surveyed over 600 businesses, organizations, and others. And the powerful message was that about 80% of businesses wanted regulation in this area. 80%, that's an extraordinary number, I can tell you from having done a lot of these surveys. That's an extraordinary and consistent number. And why do they want that? Well, they want to avoid risk. So those of you who work in business know risk is key. And if you've got so much diversity and so much lack of clarity, so much lack of coherence, then it is not good for business. And it's not then good for the victims. Why? Because in the end, the business doesn't do anything. Because they say, we don't know what to do, so they don't do anything. Some do, of course, but a lot don't. And my hope is, if companies then really, truly consider what this means for their governance, then they act to prevent it, and we don't have as many victims of business and human rights. And so it has a positive impact on the human rights, on environment, on communities, on employees, and so many others. Now, I'm pleased to say that study, which was led by Claire and Lisa, was referred to directly by the European Justice Commissioner when he introduced the idea of legislation, and referred to again when this draft came in, but it still falls short. So putting my working group hat on, let me suggest four specific ways that we could look at considering the draft in ways which are not aligning with UN Guiding Principles. First, the scope of application to businesses is limited. Because as you know, the working group says every single business has the capacity to breach human rights, every single one, and all human rights, not just some. And yet what we've got here is that only some large businesses are covered by the draft due diligence directive, and that's only slightly reduced for three sectors which are important sectors, but only 3 sectors is it reduced. So what we have is very much not the recognition that all businesses can impact human rights, and also somehow or other that only size of a business is important. We know that's not the case. A business could be round the corner operating child labor. It could be tiny. It is still breaching human rights. But somehow or other, this regulation, corporate sustainability due diligence, applies to them all. And I can add, without my working group hat on, small and medium-sized enterprises actually want this regulation too. They're not, why? Partly because they're probably down the supply chain of the big ones. So why are we just restricting it so much? In addition, there are some sectors completely excluded. The public sector, which can be really important for issues like public procurement, and also sectors such as the financial sector, a very, very crucial sector in this. So I think that's one concern we have in relation to the scope of application is too narrow. The other thing I would say is it's too narrow in relation to the type of activities that a business can have responsibility for. As we know, human rights due diligence is all about causing, contributing to, and being directly linked with in relation to actual and potential adverse human rights impacts. But here, the corporate sustainability due diligence draft limits it to established business relationships, not to direct link with business relationships, but to establish business relationships. That can be deeply problematic. Why? Because it can encourage a company to keep on throwing out their supply chain and having a new entity each time, which does not create this coherence, does not create any kind of capacity building, and creates greater risks for victims. And linked to my earlier point, if we also restrict the coverage away from financial institutions, that's crucial because the financial institution's role is absolutely important in leveraging the behavior of companies and of markets. And so it ends up being left very much to a very narrow array of sectors which are going to be covered, and also types of business relationships covered. My third point, I'll go back to the working group's roadmap. It emphasizes that states, and I quote, should clarify that meaningful and ongoing consultation with potentially affected groups and other relevant stakeholders is integral to human rights due diligence. The current draft directive mentions engagement with stakeholder and rights holders, but doesn't embed ongoing stakeholder and community consultation as an integral part of human rights due diligence. Now, this should not be optional. If we're really serious about victims' roles, but also helping companies to improve, they need to do this consultation and ongoing, not one-off, and not, as I found in my work, cherry pick. Let's just consult with them and ignore the rest. That is not what the consultation requires. And particularly some areas like Indigenous groups have a customary international right to free, fair and prior consent. None of those are referred to here. And I think that's really problematic in the broader sense of protecting victims, but also of businesses being in a better position themselves to move forward. And finally, while the draft corporate sustainability due diligence does have, pleasingly, some improved access to remedy, it does include some civil remedies as the civil liability as ways forward, has some excellent supervisory mechanisms. It doesn't seem to do anything to remove the many structural and procedural barriers there are for a victim to bring a claim. Now, once again, I speak from experience of talking to victims. Very few claims actually get to even be heard, let alone within the European context. I've been involved in 2 major cases in the UK, and they were a tiny number of the many, many people who are affected by business actions. So you need to begin removing these structural and procedural barriers and using the corporate sustainability due diligence process. You're not doing that. Businesses get a repeat lot of new claimants, which doesn't help anybody. I mean, I think we rightly have to focus on victims, but often states get so worried about what businesses think, they end up not recognizing actually it's sometimes in businesses' interest to have clarity in this area. And certainly this is some of the excellent work that others have done on access to remedy. So I just have 2 final points. Let me be clear that the working group is supportive of regulatory development, and it likes the fact there is this EU improvement on clarity about corporate sustainability due diligence. However, we would urge the European Commission to revise its draft to ensure that there is greater alignment with the UNGPs as the authoritative standard in relation to business and human rights, for the sake of all businesses and above all, for the sake of all potential victims. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And so now we're going to start with our first panel. And like with the other panels that we have designed for this conference, the idea is really to hear voices from different stakeholders. So we'll have people from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, that's a chair, Tomislav. We'll hear people from syndicates, both in Europe and also in Pakistan, to think a bit about the implication of the directive outside of Europe. We'll have also speakers from the Institute of Business and Human Rights and Business, shall I say, people from companies, because we want to hear the voice of companies as well in this debate. It's very important. And from the World Benchmark Alliance. And this is sort of the format we want to follow throughout the conference. We want to hear civil society, we want to hear business, we want to hear government, we want to hear scholars, we want to hear everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Tomislav and to the speakers of the first panel, which I will invite to join on the floor. And thank you again so much for our keynote